You've probably heard it a million times. Sykes-Picot drew the Middle East borders. ISIS cited it when they bulldozed the Iraq-Syria border. Kurdish independence advocates point to it. Analysts on Palestine bring it up constantly. And politicians love to say Britain and France carved up the Middle East with a ruler. But guess what? They're all wrong. I went through the original documents, the actual Sykes-Picot text, the Hussein-McMahon letters, San Remo records and League of Nations archives, and what I found, it's not what we've been told. Let's break it down. People say this 1916 map drew the borders, but look at the proof, or actually the lack of it. Take Mosul. Oil-rich, strategic, absolutely crucial. Sykes-Picot put it in the French zone, but it ended up in British Iraq 10 years later. After years of negotiations, oil company deals and League of Nations commission, Iraq's borders finalized in 1926, Syria-Palestine 1923, Transjordan 1921. Not 1916, we're talking 10 to 15 years later. And here's why that matters. When we blame everything on one 1916 map, we miss the actual story. The decade of broken promises, the oil deals, the local resistance that changed things, all of it gets erased. Because here's what people forget. These places already existed. Look at this Ottoman map from 1893. 3 provinces, Basra, Baghdad and Mosul, and across them the label Al-Iraq al-Arabi, Arab Iraq. Iraq wasn't invented by Europeans, neither was Syria. These lined up with Ottoman provinces like Damascus, Aleppo and Beirut. So when Europeans showed up, they weren't drawing on a blank map, they were redrawing someone else's. And that's where the real problem starts, because Britain didn't just draw bad borders, they made 3 completely contradictory promises to 3 different groups about the same land. July 14, 1915, Sharif Hussein of Mecca writes to Britain, demanding a massive Arab kingdom, Syria, Iraq, Arabia and even Palestine. On October 23, 1915, the British High Commissioner Henry McMahon replies, and I'm quoting directly here, "Subject to the above modifications, Great Britain is prepared to recognize and support the independence of the Arabs in all the regions within the limits demanded by the Sharif of Mecca." Now, those modifications excluded some coastal areas. Historians still argue about whether that meant Palestine was in or out, but the promise of Arab independence, that was clear. So that's promise number 1. 6 months later, May 1916, Britain secretly signs a deal with France, the Sykes-Picot Agreement. They draw a diagonal line from Acre to Kirkuk. Blue zone, France controls coastal Syria and Lebanon. Red zone, Britain gets southern Iraq. Area A, French influence. Area B, British influence. And the brown zone, Palestine, under international administration. The exact same land they just promised to Hussein. That's promise number 2. And here's where it gets really complicated. November 23, 1915, 7 months before Sykes-Picot was even signed. At a meeting in London, 7 British officials brief François-Georges Picot, the French negotiator, on the promise they'd already made to the Arabs. And, according to the official British minutes of that meeting, Picot says, "To promise the Arabs a large state is to throw dust in their eyes. Such a state will never materialize." They knew the Arab promises were lies, and they signed the agreement anyway. Then comes November 2nd, 1917. Foreign Secretary Arthur Balfour writes to Lord Rothschild saying Britain supports the establishment in Palestine of a national home for the Jewish people. Same Palestine, same land. That's promise number 3. 3 promises, 2 years, 1 massive contradiction. So, if Sykes-Picot didn't create the final borders, what did? Well, it took 15 years, A world war ending, oil being discovered, local uprisings, and endless diplomatic negotiations. April 1920, the San Remo Conference. The Allies formally assign mandates. France gets Syria and Lebanon, Britain gets Mesopotamia and Palestine. But, and this is crucial, the fine print says exact boundaries to be determined by the principal Allied powers. Translation, we'll figure it out later. And later drags on for years. Britain promises Iraq independence. Then they find oil in Mosul. Suddenly, independence means another decade of British control while they negotiate who gets the oil concessions. 1922, Britain and Ibn Saud sign a treaty fixing the Iraq-Najd border. 1925 to 26, a League of Nations commission spends months investigating the Mosul question. They hear testimony from local leaders, examine ethnic composition, consider economic factors, and then award it to British Iraq. Not because of self-determination, but because Britain had better infrastructure and oil development plans. 1932. Iraq finally gains independence, 16 years after Sykes-Picot. And that language of temporary control is still being used today. When Israel's defense minister said in 2024 they'd stay in Syrian territory until another arrangement is found, that's the exact same language Britain used in Iraq a century ago. An occupation with no end date, waiting for conditions that never quite materialize. But here's what the Europeans drew all the borders myth misses. Locals fought back, and sometimes they won. August 10, 1920, the Treaty of Sèvres tries to formalize the Ottoman breakup, carving up Turkey itself. Turkey says no. Atatürk leads the Turkish War of Independence from 1919 to 1923, defeating Greek, Armenian, and French armies. Then, on July 24, 1923, the Treaty of Lausanne replaces Sèvres. Turkey regains its land. European powers back down. That's not a line on a map. That's a military victory rewriting the map. In Iraq, the 1920 uprising, a massive revolt against British occupation, forces Britain to completely rethink how they rule. They install Faisal ibn Hussein, the same Arab leader who'd briefly ruled Syria before the French expelled him, as king of Iraq. The new monarchy looks independent, but Britain still holds the real power. The borders don't change, but the governance does. And that's still shaped by resistance. These weren't just European lines on paper that everyone accepted. So, fast forward to 2014. ISIS bulldozes the Iraq-Syria border, declaring, "We're erasing Sykes-Picot." But that border was finalized in 1923, not 1916. Kurdish activists cite Sykes-Picot for dividing Kurdistan across 4 countries. Palestine experts point to it as the origin of broken promises. Syria analysts call it the root of their civil war. And look, they're not wrong that European powers screwed things up. The 3 contradictory promises were real. The disregard for local populations was real. But when we say one secret map in 1916 created all this, we're missing what actually happened. It wasn't one map. It was a decade plus of negotiations driven by oil, shaped by resistance, and finalized through commissions and treaties that came years later. And those contradictory promises, those were the real poison. Not the specific lines, but the intentional lies to 3 different groups about who would control the same land. So, let's be clear about what the evidence actually shows. 1. Britain made 3 conflicting promises between 1915 and 1917. Hussein-McMahon, Sykes-Picot, and Balfour. The French negotiator himself said the Arab state was being thrown dust in their eyes. They knew it was a lie. 2. The borders we have today weren't fixed in 1916. They came from 15 years of negotiations, oil deals, League of Nations commissions, and local resistance. Mosul in 1926, Syria-Lebanon in 1923, and Iraq independence in 1932. 3. Locals weren't passive. Turkey fought and won. Iraq and Syrian populations resisted and forced changes. Not always to borders, but to governance. The final map wasn't just what Europeans wanted. When politicians today blame artificial borders on Sykes-Picot, they're repeating a century-old myth that erases the actual history. European powers did make contradictory promises. The borders do shape modern conflicts, but they came from a long, contested process where oil, resistance, and geopolitics all played a role, not just one secret map. If you want more evidence-based history that breaks down what actually happened, instead of what we've been told, hit subscribe. Thanks for watching, see you in the next one.